Next, from Springfield, we talked to Darren Root, the superintendent of the Auburn School District, and Mike Tomlinson, a consultant for the Champaign and Ford County School Districts, about Senate Bill 100, which would establish specific guidelines for school discipline. This runs about 25 minutes.
Gentlemen, thanks for joining us on the All-Night Channel. We wanted to talk to you about SB-100, which is a bill that passed last year, and addresses some of the issues of discipline in the classroom and how that should be handled. And Joe, you are a consultant. Give us, if you will, first of all, kind of the big picture view. What does this bill do, and what problem is it trying to address?
Well, Senate Bill 100 was passed to look at a different mindset in administering discipline in the school districts. In the past, probably the mindset has been more punitive, exclusion from school. And today, as a result of the Senate Bill 100, we're looking at more restorative mindset of what can teachers, administrators do to keep the kids in school and not suspend or expel to the degree that we have in the past.
And right at one of the issues was that there was just not enough of an established order, so that there was no consistency in applying discipline from one school to the next, or maybe from one teacher to the next.
Well, there was somewhat consistency in that one of the things that is left in the bill is zero tolerance, so which means that if you and I are in a fight, we both got the same amount out and we both got the same discipline. Now we're looking at it on a case-by-case basis, and that each is an individual based on behavior, based on background, based on grades, based on many things.
What led to this? In other words, were complaints coming from family members whose child was disciplined and they said it was applied in an unfair and unequal way?
The impetus came from Chicago, from a group of students, VOYCE, Voice of Youth in Chicago Education, who had done research and provided it for a senator, Senator Lightford, who took the impetus to take this to the General Assembly and the House and Senate and all that. And it was passed through there, sent to our administrators, and at the outset, the administration, IESA, Illinois School Association of School Administrators, and also Illinois Principals Association, did not agree with it at first. But through rewrites and other kinds of things, came to at least on a non-negative plateau where they would at least accept it, and now it's been, of course, enacted as a bill and starts September 15th of next year.
And Superintendent Root, let me touch base with you, because Mr. Tomlinson here touched on one of the issues. Is this something for those who are operating schools that's being, so to speak, shoved down your throat, or is this something that you welcome?
Well, we do have a lot of things that are shoved down our throat, but this is really well intended, and schools that are doing the right thing with discipline shouldn't be impacted too much, because it does talk about the accountability piece. It talks about doing what's best for the students, and that's really what it's all about. We have to remember that when students or use any other sort of discipline, the ultimate goal is to alter their behavior. And the only problem that most school districts, I think, are dealing with is that when one situation happens in one piece of the state and there's a shotgun approach to solve it, then we are basically losing local control. In my school district, it's relatively small, and most of the parents I know, the kids I know, and what may work for one student may not work for the other student. Sometimes a phone call at home is the best answer, and you work closely with the parents. So that's basically the one thing that I think is the most important piece to understand with this, is that it's well intended, and we all have to make the best choices for our individual students, regardless of what how this is spelled out.
So specifically, what does this do? I mean, does it say, you know, you get punished so much on the first incidence, on the second instance, on the third? Does it work in that form of a gradation of application?
Well, it gives you stair-step approach of accountability. A student shouldn't just all of a sudden be suspended as your first piece of discipline.
Had that happened in the past?
Not always. I'm sure it does at some school districts, which is why we have this in place.
And let me interject. Yeah. Why you have it in place, because in one school district, discipline would be applied one way, in a different school district a different way. It was all kind of left up to the local administrators. So just to make sure we're following as the viewers, is this then applying a uniform code across the state on how discipline issues should be addressed?
It has some uniformity to it now, because there is some professional discretion that has taken place and should take place, which is why some districts are having a hard time with it. But it is uniform, it is well-intended so that the students' rights are also addressed, and I think that's the biggest piece. And if school districts are doing that anyway, this should not be a huge adjustment.
The problem, you tell me, Mr. Thomas, the problem is that not all students might be created equal, but not all parents are created equal. And the environment from an Auburn school is going to be entirely different than one in East St. Louis or the south side of Chicago, where there's going to be much more levels of poverty. How does this legislation address the differences of one district to the next?
And I think it was designed to look at it from not just a minority or a majority viewpoint. It's designed to look at it from a minority as well as socioeconomic viewpoint. Where did the kids come from? What's the best for this district? And as he said earlier, it's an individual thing from the standpoint of each district's makeup. When we teach these classes, we teach mainly teachers to start looking at it totally differently in a restorative way, which means how can we make this kid or have this kid come out of this feeling good about themselves, yet still have a discipline side to it. And so that's tough because we've, over the past, had a punitive mindset in a lot of school districts. And so that's a complete turnaround for the thinking is looking at a situation. When we started out today with a very example where two kids get into a fight, one from maybe a low socioeconomic background, one from a high, good grades, etc. Each will be taken on its own merit, and each will be looked at on a case-by-case basis, and then the appropriate discipline applied.
In talking with educators over the years, one of the things that people will tell me off camera is the discipline problems they have. And too many times the only issue we hear on camera or among our public officials is that we need to spend more money on education, and never taking into account the lack of discipline that is happening in some classrooms in some school districts. I have often said in talking with school teachers, and what they've told me is you could spend $100,000 a year per pupil in an education environment that people can learn in if you don't have discipline in the classroom. Will this, in your estimation, get us to where we need to be on that?
I think in some cases I don't know that it'll get us to the utopia that we all hope for, but what I think it will do is make it more understandable for parents and teachers about what we want, where we want this to go, and how we want kids to turn out. There's no question there's been a frustrating thing for classroom teachers and for administrators in terms of trying to do things. Pouring more money into it probably hasn't done any more than anything else. So they're asking us to look at it from the terms of a mindset, and asking us to look at it totally differently than what we have in the past. So I think from that standpoint, understanding, if I'm a white teacher and come from a pretty, middle class background, and I don't have an understanding of where either the low socioeconomic white student or African American or Hispanic come from, then it's very difficult for me. I jump at the first thing to get them out of school rather than to figure out where's this coming from and how can we keep them in school.
So does this empower the teacher? I've had some teachers, again, in the past tell me that they don't feel like administration backs them up, that they try to send a kid out and they don't want to deal with it, and they bring this troublemaker back into the classroom. Is that going to change that? Is that going to can we get the troublemakers out of the classroom faster? Or is this going to prolong the process before you can get those kids out? And maybe it's counter to having a good educational environment in the classroom.
But we have to remember, too, that the goal of the school district is to educate kids. It's not to administer justice. And I think a lot of people get that mixed up. Even sometimes staff feel like there's some justice that has to be administered when there's students that misbehave. They're kids. They will misbehave, but it's our job to make sure that they're educated regardless if they follow the rules or don't follow the rules. And there's many things, other tools in the toolbox besides suspensions that can happen. This just really focuses on the suspensions.
What kind of disciplines, Ken, you had talked about the stair step. What are some of the steps that go from A to Z?
Well, when you address the discipline problems in the classroom, instead of jumping to a suspension, there's all sorts of interventions that we have that can take place depending on the age of the students and the maturity level of the students. Of course, at the grade school, there are things that the students want, such as recess, or if you isolate them at lunch or things like that. Just connecting with the students and having positive reinforcement, reinforcing what's good instead of putting attention on the things that they struggle with and behaviors that they struggle with. I think really that's what gets to the soul of the problem here. When we have school districts that really struggle with discipline issues and they're only falling back on suspensions and excluding students from their educational rights, that's when we have problems. And I think that this kind of addresses this issue, so we're not jumping to suspensions. So we are dealing with these students, and they realize that they are wanted in the school. They're not wanted. We don't want to exclude any student, and our main goal is to educate them, not to discipline them.
Yeah, I mean, there's no question, and the shame is that, as I say, none of us got to pick our parents.
No.
And there's a wide discrepancy. Some parents are very involved in their children's education, some are not involved at all. I don't know that this is ever going to address that or that even schools can address that, but at some point, if someone is disruptive to the entire environment of learning, as you say, you're there to educate, after a while you're going to have to get rid of the bad apples, right?
Well, we have to remember, too, suspensions is for the good of everybody else in the school. A lot of people think that you suspend a student because it's what's best for that student. That's not the case. By the time you exclude a student from an educational environment, it's because you have all these other students that need to have a little breather to have time to learn. It's a little timeout period. And so, Senate Bill 100 really addresses this and makes some of these requirements mandatory so that all the administrators have to think about what's important.
Do you, as a superintendent, and you had mentioned earlier, it was mentioned that the principals were initially against this, that you as an organization, not as an individual, have had enough input in this and that your concerns were listened to?
It's always good to be on the front end of conversations. We're not always on the front end of conversations, but that's okay. That's not the way the system is. The administrators in my district have embraced this. They don't see it as something that is, a negative change. And one reason is because they're confident in their jobs and what they're doing. They're making the good decisions now, and that's really what this is about.
Mr. Tomlinson, I would say everyone, in one way or another, or by and large the population, is engaged in education in that they they're paying for it, and that a lot of them have kids in the process or had kids in the process. To what extent has the educational environment changed over the last 40 years? And what I'm getting at is a lot of people who are adults now, who are parents, they extrapolate their experience in the classroom from the 1960s or 70s as if it's the same today. And how much of a gap is there between what we as parents imagine is happening in schools versus what the reality is?
Well, as I said in our workshop today, we began probably 30 or 40 years ago with corporal punishment, and everybody knew what that was. And in some cases, we probably did have some good schools in the process. And then we went to exclusion or alternative types of punishment, and then we went to exclusionary, which means out-of-school suspensions. Research has shown through the VOYCE, Voices of Youth in Chicago Education, that that's not working, that the data is there, that it's not driving down suspensions, it's not causing there to be less fights, there's not less disturbance. What I would say at this point is that there's a couple of things that should parents a safer feeling, and that is that if weapons are brought in, if drugs sale beyond or drug distribution beyond a certain amount, they still have the opportunity to exclude them from school, even up to and including expulsion. So that's still not taken away. That's still under their purview. So I think it's a mass change from where we were 40 years ago to corporal punishment to today, where we're looking at positive ways to discuss and relate to students. Also, parents have the option to now, in this law, come in, or not the option, they're required to come in and have a reentry conference after a suspension, which means that the administrator, if there's a teacher involved, the student will be there, and so that everybody knows what's expected and a plan developed, a positive plan for going forward. And that's for all kids. That's just not for, any individual kid, so they must do that.
Does this apply any greater responsibility, one way or another, on parents?
It does. As I said this morning, I'm not sure, but they had talked about making it some kind of, violation for parents if they don't show up for this. I don't know how you'd police that or whatever, but it's certainly a requirement in the law that parents come for the reentry conference.
Is this going to cause school districts to spend a lot more money? Are there going to be legal fees attached to this and challenges in court where all of a sudden the classrooms become a litigious environment instead of an educational environment?
We've been that pretty much for the last few years anyway, so that's not something that, but I think there will be cases on this. We talked this morning about that some of the cases will be about the rights of kids, whether it was applied evenly and fairly from student to student, whether the number of days suspended out was appropriate. So that's why parents have this opportunity to come in and appeal it if they want, and have a hearing with a hearing officer. And they've always had that. It's just now they're going to know it more, and be able to use that as a tool.
Before I let you, on the implementation, where does it stand? When does it become fully implemented at one point, or is it?
The law says September 15th of 2016, which is this September, but what we're advocating is that policy be passed that schools start at the first day of school, so that you don't have one implementation on August 25th or whatever and another one on September 16th.
Which is a good transition to the last part I was going to say. Just let's say, aside from the discipline issue, let's go to, for a minute, the funding. Right now, as everyone knows, the budget wasn't passed last year, with the exception of K-12 education was signed into law. This year, Senate Democrats at least are threatening not to have any funding for the schools unless their reforms, promoted primarily by Senator Menard, are implemented. What does that do for you as a superintendent? What are your thoughts about this?
Well, of course, the state's in a terrible financial situation now, and we are about % dependent on the state. It's an awful position to be in. Of course, you have two sets of revenue. The local property taxes is what is the revenue's based on, which is the other 50% of our revenue. The biggest problem is that they're looking also at a local property tax freeze. I know it's a very popular piece for votes, but those are really our only two sources of revenue. If you freeze your local property taxes and you take away your general state aid, there are school districts that can't function for much longer. Some may not be able to open up at the beginning of the school year because of it. It's very difficult to move forward. I think that some of these proposals about redistributing the revenue that's already there kind of misses the point a little bit. It's a little distracting. The bigger picture is the big revenue piece altogether. We need more money. No one wants to talk about more taxes. Nobody wants to talk about reamortizing the debt or the real solutions. Some of these proposals, like Bill 231, talks a little bit about basically taking from poor districts and giving it to the poorer districts, and it's not fulfilling the total obligation by the state. We've had late payments. You have proration of general state aid. You also have an old foundation level, a formula that hasn't been moved since 2009. You can't run a household if you don't have the revenue. School districts have cut beyond what is even fathomable. If you still have places to cut, you're not running it efficiently in the first place. We don't have anything left to cut. I have a school district with fewer than 200 employees, and in my 4 years, I've cut 38 positions. It's pretty substantial, and we're pretty bare bones. So this battle that's going on in Springfield right now is more serious, I think, than most people think. They drive by schools, the lights are on, the buses still run. But if the state doesn't come through with their payments and the bills can't be paid, we're looking at real serious conversations about closing school districts or not opening the doors when school starts. Every school district has a little bit different situation with their fund balances, with when their local property taxes come in. And so every school district would have a different scenario, maybe their debt limit and how much they can borrow. But the bottom line is that the legislators in Springfield have to look at the overall picture and the amount of money that's coming in that is needed to continue the educational institutions in the state.
Joe, I don't know, is that an area that you get into?
No, it's not mine.
I don't want to.
Mine's more human resources and training.
And so to that end, what are you as a superintendent on the timeline? What are you doing now? And what I'm getting at is, we should have already had a budget in place. We don't. And so you're going to have to probably delay making some decisions because you don't know how much you're going to get and when it's going to come. When do you just start driving through red lights, so to speak, and to where all of a sudden it becomes a train wreck because you just weren't able to make those decisions you should have made in a more timely fashion, so that even if they pass a budget by July 1st or July 15th, at what point does it become almost too late to start school on time?
School districts are faced with these financial problems now. For example, in my school district, it costs us about $1 million a month to run the district. With our local revenue that comes in, and you look at your current fund balance, you just do the math and see how long you can last without any state revenue. And it's going to land differently for every school. A lot of schools, I would be surprised if they would make it through Christmas with no more revenue from the state. So it's a serious thing, and I just hope that the smart people in Springfield can get this figured out.
Last question, and because again we could talk all day on these issues there, but you're a superintendent. Auburn, for those who don't know, be watching from the Chicagoland and others, is a relatively small community, we might say a bedroom community of Springfield, about 20 miles or so south of Springfield. So you're one of the areas that Senator Menard would talk about. He would say that in those rural districts where there's not a lot of commercial property to tax, or in low property value districts such as in East St. Louis or the South Side Chicago, you're just not going to be taxing the way we're taxing, enough revenue to really get the job done, and that education shouldn't be based upon the zip code that you happen to be born into. Is he right on that as one who is a superintendent of a relatively rural area?
Yeah, that's what general state aid is supposed to do. It's supposed to make up the difference for those that cannot generate enough local revenue. So the whole idea of this cost shift to the local taxpayers isn't reasonable because the revenue is just not there. So the other problem I think with these proposals is that it loses sight of the main piece, that we don't have the revenue coming in. And what would scare me more about some of these passing, not that there's good pieces in them, it's that there would be a mentality that the problem's fixed. It's not fixed. It's bigger than just trying to get a budget passed for this year to keep the doors open this year. The way schools are funded are broken, and there's a much bigger piece that needs to be addressed.
What amongst, such as?
Well, a lot of proposals that are out there talk about not relying on property taxes at all. This is the main structure. I don't have the solution, or I wouldn't be standing here. But I do know that the way that it's set up now, when the state started out making late payments, that they counted as the first payment of the next year, which was really the last payment of the prior year. And then the foundation level in the formula that was frozen since 2009. And then the proration on an old foundation level. I mean, we are millions and millions of dollars behind from previous years. So trying to get to the current level, here we're celebrating when they can prorate on an old foundation level at 91 or 92%. We're still losing that revenue.
I'll ask you one more question just because you kind of led to something. The governor is saying, now for the viewers, the foundation level is supposed to be $6,119 a year per pupil, but the state hasn't. I don't like the word proration, it's a cut. The state's been spending less than the $6,119, so it's an oxymoron to say that is a foundation level because we're below that level. I think last year or so it was about 89% of that level of spending. The governor is saying, let's get up to where we're fully funding the foundation level at the 6119. And we'll spend the next year working on restructuring the formula. Again, the Senate Democrats at this point are kind of saying, no, we've spent nearly 20 years with a bad system, no point in going forward. Where do you as an educator fall within that bookends of the discussion?
Well, most school districts in my area will cost between $8,000 to $9,000 per student per year. So the foundation level is way behind as it is. So the best case scenario under that proposal is still a disaster. I don't know if that answers your question or not.
Well, should we try to figure it out, given that maybe one more year? And I don't know the answer. I'm not trying to suggest an answer here. I'm just asking. Or would you say it's best that we don't have schools open on time if we can fix the funding formula, and that we open in October if we have to?
No, the absolute goal is to open on time. I don't think there's anybody who wants to use that as a political leverage. There's nobody who wants to put the students out there as a political piece. The goal for Auburn and the goal for all the schools, I'm sure, is to provide the education no matter how we can get our hands on the resources.
All right, well, gentlemen, we appreciate your time, and maybe we can follow up again with you.
All right, thank you
Thanks.
so much.
Appreciate it.
You're watching the Illinois Channel, an independent nonprofit corporation formed to provide gavel-to-gavel coverage of Illinois state government and other public affairs events taking place across Illinois.